Is there a hidden meaning in the phrase made in God's image in Genesis 1:27? What does that even mean? People have speculated on this for a long time. Do we look like God? Is it that we can reason and think like God? Is it that we have a body, soul, and spirit like God is triune? The truth is that the phrase made in the image of God is not about physical appearance, but it is about a divine purpose. What does that mean, and how does it affect our outlook on Genesis 1 through 2? Let's talk about it. Welcome to the Word Room, where we make difficult Bible passages make sense. In this video, I'm continuing a series on Genesis 1 through 3. So far in this series, we have seen that Genesis 1 and 2 is not about the material beginnings of the universe, but rather the cultural context of Genesis 1 reveals that Genesis 1 was a response to the creation myths of the time, correcting their corrupted theology and showing that Yahweh, the God of Israel, was the one true creator God worthy to be worshipped. And it shows how God is ordering a cosmic temple. In the last video, we saw that in Genesis 1, the word create in Hebrew bara does not mean to create out of nothing, but instead was speaking of defining function or purpose. If you have not seen those videos, I encourage you to go back and watch those videos to understand the framework we are building on today in this video. The link is in the description and the pinned comment below. For the playlist, you can click on it and see all the videos there in order. So let's pick up where we left off at the last video. We saw how the Hebrew word for create, bara, can speak of bringing about function out of pre-existing material. And we looked at the context of the first 5 days of creation listed in Genesis 1 to show that is exactly what is happening in Genesis 1. It is bringing about function, or explaining or defining function and purpose for all of these things that exist in the universe. So what about day 6? God creates land animals and specifically mankind. How does this idea of function play into the baraing, or creating, of humans? And how does that connect into being made in the image of God? Well, that's what we're going to focus in on this video. What does it mean for humans to be in the image of God? The imago Dei, which is the Latin phrase for image of God, is a huge part of the Genesis creation account. But what does it mean? Some people have posited that we physically look like God because God has arms and legs and a mouth and different things within Scripture. However, from Scripture, we know that God is spirit, and therefore he appears in form to us at times, but God himself is spirit and doesn't have form like we think of form. So it's not that we look like God. Could it be that we are psychologically like God? We are rational and moral and creative? Well, that depends. If you say that the image of God is only about rationality and morality, being able to make moral decisions, then you actually are saying now that children in the womb are not in the image of God because they can't rationalize or make moral decisions, or newborn children. If that's the image of God and newborns or children in the womb don't have it, then you remove the concept of the image of God from them. And the image of God becomes something not that you have as a human, but something that you develop in your brain. Also, we see from the text of Scripture that angels have the ability to reason and have the ability to make moral decisions. So if that's what it means to be in the image of God, you'd also be claiming angels are in the image of God. So if it's not those things, then what does it mean? Well, let's look at the verses in question. Genesis 1:26 through 27. And God said, "Let us make man in our image, after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the fowl of the air, and over the cattle, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creepeth upon the earth." So God created man in his own image. In the image of God created he him. Male and female created he them. What's interesting is that there's something tied to the image of God for both male and female, that the male and female creation, both humans, all humans, male and female, are all in the image of God. This is not just for Adam, which we'll talk about later. It's not just for the males of the human species. It is for all humans, male and female. Now, there's some key words we need to look at in this passage. First is the word image. What does the word image mean? The phrase "in our image" in the passage in verse 26 is the Hebrew word betzelmenu, with the root word image itself being tselem. This word in Hebrew means image, semblance, likeness, and so it's tied to the word in our image, in our likeness. It's the same. They're using those as synonyms there. And the word image means in our likeness, in our similitude, in our semblance, or in our image. There's something fascinating about this word when you look at its usage in the Bible. In the Hebrew scriptures, the word for image here, tselem, is used 17 times in the Old Testament or in the Hebrew scriptures. 3 of those times it is used as man being in God's image. One time it is saying that Adam's son was in the image of Adam. 2 times it speaks of making images to represent 2 plagues that came on the Philistines. So they actually made golden mice and tumors. 1 time it is used to speak of sculptures or paintings representing Chaldean men. 1 time it is used to speak of the shadow of a person. And then every other time it is used to speak of idols. So for a moment, let's set aside all of the usages where it is used to speak of God making man in his image or man being the image of God. We'll set those aside because that's what we're trying to determine what it means. Let's look at the other usages to see if we can gain any idea of what this word is talking about. So I mentioned that it's used to speak of images representing the plagues that came on the Philistines when they had taken the Ark of the Covenant. These were actually golden figurines that they made of tumors and mice, which are the plagues that came upon the Philistines. Now, what's important to remember is that these golden figurines were not actually the tumors and the mice themselves. They were just representations of the tumors and mice. They were golden figurines that represented the plagues. What about the painting of Chaldean men? This is found in Ezekiel 23:14. And these images were not the actual Chaldean men themselves. They were just depictions or representatives of the Chaldean men. Are you seeing a pattern here? If you find this interesting and are getting something out of this, click that like button below. It really helps out the YouTube algorithm. So let's look at these other examples. What about being the shadow of a man? This is found in Psalm 39:6. The shadow of a person is not the actual person, but a 2D representation of them. So as you can see, there's this pattern of being representative or representations of something. What about idols, though? This is the main use of the word. We think of idols, at least most of us do when we think of idols. We think of statues from the Old Testament that people actually thought were God. But in reality, graven images and idols started with the idea that the statues weren't the gods themselves, but were representative of the God they worshipped, seen or unseen, and that the gods would put their spirit in the image so that God could be present with man. One idea you could think of with this is when the Israelites came out of Egypt, when they were in the wilderness, they had Aaron fashion the golden calf. And they didn't worship the golden calf as if the calf itself was God. They created the golden calf and said, "Behold, Yahweh, who brought you out of Egypt." They were claiming the golden calf was Yahweh, but it was a representation of Yahweh, and that the idea would be that the spirit of Yahweh would fill the golden calf. And God was angry at that because that's not how God works. It wasn't supposed to be the statues that were the image of God. It was supposed to be man, and God's plan was to put his spirit in us. To give you an example of how this worked with idols, here's a quote from Old Testament scholar Dr. Edward M. Curtis. "To the Egyptians and Mesopotamians, and almost certainly to the Canaanites as well, images were not the inanimate objects that the Hebrew prophets insisted they were. Rather, they were living, feeling beings in which the deity was actually present. The primary significance of images lay in the fact that the life of the deity was thought to be present inside of the statue. The Egyptian view is expressed in a passage from the Memphite theology, which says, 'He placed the gods in their shrines. He settled their offerings. He established their shrines. He made their bodies according to their wishes. Thus the gods entered into their bodies of every wood, every stone, every clay.' The gods were thought to manifest themselves in a variety of ways to animate a variety of objects, but the cult image was a primary focus of the god's presence on earth. Numerous Egyptian texts, though coming from mostly the Greek and Roman periods, describe the god in the form of a bird descending from heaven to alight his image. Morans says that this figure represents the living substance of the deity, which is imparted to the inanimate image. So what he's saying here is that these idols, these images of the gods, were physical images on earth that were not the god themselves, but were representative of the god, and that God would then fill those things with its spirit. The Hebrew word image here carries this idea of representation filled with God. So the idea of being an image of God was to be a representative of that God that is being worshiped and to be filled with the spirit of that God. The idea that man would be the image of God is that we would represent God on the earth, carrying his presence within us to the earth around us. It was a job. That is the cultural context of this phrase. When the ancient Israelites would have heard the phrase, God made man in his image, they would have immediately understood the image of God in the context of idols. It wasn't about the way they physically looked. The idols, if you actually look at ancient cultures, most of the idols looked exactly the same. They had many similar features. Some idols could represent two different gods and be completely almost similar in the way they looked, but they represented two different gods. But the reason why is because they weren't physically looking like the god. They were just a representative of the God that would then fill the image. That's the idea of man being made in God's image. It's a job, not a description of ontology or physiology. It's a job, it's a description, it's a purpose, it's a function that man is supposed to fill in the earth. We are supposed to represent God, and in doing so, he fills us so we carry his presence into the earth. That is the job of humans. The other word that is important in this text that backs this up is the preposition in. Make man in our image. What does it mean to be in? The preposition in can be used various ways in English and in Hebrew. Let me give you some examples from English. If I say put the dishes in the sink, that word in there is denoting location, right? Where do I want you to put the dishes? In the sink. But if I say that my son's homework is written in pencil, we're not talking about location. We're talking about the instrumentality. If I said I broke the vase in pieces, the word in there now, again, is not talking about location or instrumentality, how I broke the vase. It's talking about the result. It's in pieces. That is the result of what happened. If I say this or that in reply, now we're talking about purpose or process. What are you doing? You're replying. If I say I work in accounting, or I work in the medical field, or I work in real estate, now what am I talking about? Now I'm using the word in a functional capacity. And this is my job, it's my function. And this is how the word in is being used when it says we are made in the image of God. You can actually interchange the word in with as here. We are made as the image of God. We are to represent him and carry his presence with us. And just so you don't think I'm making this stuff up, this is actually a well-known understanding by biblical scholars. Let me quote some for you. Biblical scholar Dr. Joshua Moritz says, as Abraham was chosen by God from among the nations, so humans are chosen by God from among the multiplicity of life forms to serve as priests of the cosmic temple and to represent God's purposes and will to their fellow organic co-heirs of God's kingdom. Humans are the image of God, not by biological nature or right, but through election from among the animals by divine grace. As human animals by form and nature, we are biological priests by vocation, and as such are called and anointed to be the agents in God's renewal of God's whole creation, from Adam to Noah, and from Abraham to Christ. Being in the image of God speaks to our vocation as priests in God's cosmic temple. Old Testament and biblical scholar Horst Dietrich Prauss wrote in his second volume of Old Testament theology, humans were taken into service as the partner of God, a word that probably best and most comprehensively translates the meaning of image and likeness. These terms make no statements about the nature of human beings, but rather intent to describe humanity's function as willed by God. Humans represent God in a prescribed realm and receive for this purpose certain qualities which do not make them godlike, but rather elevates them to be partners of God. Biblical scholar Dr. J. Richard Middleton says, careful exegesis of Genesis 1:26-28 does indeed suggest that the Imago Dei refers to human rule, that is, the exercise of power on God's behalf in creation. A royal, functional reading of the Imago Dei is essentially confirmed. This last quote is of extreme importance. Notice that Middleton speaks of this being royal function, and Moritz speaks of us being priests. The idea of rulership and connection to God are seen here, and that is more fleshed out, so to speak, in Genesis chapter 2, which we will get into in the next video. For now, the key is to recognize that Genesis 1 and the 7 days of creation were not about the chronological material beginnings of the universe, but rather was about revealing to Israel the function of the universe as a cosmic temple of God and their role in that cosmic temple. It was about God showing them that the false gods in the nations around them were not worthy to be worshipped, and that He alone was the one true God, and the cosmos was His temple, and they were His people as His image to rule as kings and priests in the earth. In the next video in this series, we are going to see more about the function of His temple and unravel the mystery of the Garden of Eden and Adam and Eve. Until then, check out this video where I correct the crazy conspiracy theory that Yahweh had a wife named Asherah. See you next time.